Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. President Trump's trade war with China may have begun with tariffs and talk of trade deficits, but it quickly moved on to addressing U.S. security concerns and accusations that Beijing is spying and stealing American technology, which poses a significant threat to American interests and well-being. It's led some leading experts to predict that armed conflict between the two countries is more likely than not. Large-Kishore Mahbubani, a Singaporean academic and former diplomat, addresses what he calls American paranoia and the myth of Chinese aggression in What China Threat?, the cover story of the February issue of Harper's Magazine, and he joins us now from Singapore. Welcome to our show.
My pleasure to be with you.
You argue that the most important event of 2001 wasn't the 9/11 attacks, but the People's Republic of China's entry into the World Trade Organization.
Because you know why? That changed the relationship between China and the world fundamentally, because all of a sudden, China injected 800 million new workers into the global capitalist system, and that would inevitably create what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. So lots of workers in America and Europe lost their jobs as a result of China joining the global capitalist system. And the big mistake that many Americans and European leaders made was their failure to anticipate this and to deal with this. And this is how eventually in 2016, Donald Trump got elected. It was a result in many ways of the shock that was created by China's entry into the WTO. It was a shock that should have been and could have been managed.
Last year, the trade deficit with China increased to $344 billion. But in recent negotiations, hasn't China agreed to a number of trade concessions, from removing key restrictions on U.S. auto parts to buying more goods from the United States, which would reduce that trade deficit?
Yes, there's absolutely no question that China wants to reach a deal with the United States of America. And frankly, China is ready to make and will probably make very generous concessions to the United States of America to avoid an all-out trade war. Because the fundamental difference between the approach that China is taking and America is taking towards this whole trade war is that China has a clear, coherent, long-term strategy on how to manage its rise. And the United States, very sadly, and I say this as a friend of America, America doesn't have any kind of coherent long-term strategy on how to deal with a new power that is inevitably going to become bigger than the United States of America. And nothing can stop China from becoming bigger. And therefore, the reason why I wrote the article in Harper's is to wake up Americans to say, hey, you need a coherent and cohesive long-term strategy to deal with this new challenge. And you can't do this just by flailing about and imposing tariffs and prosecuting Chinese nationals. That's not going to get you anywhere. You need a broad, comprehensive strategy to deal with China.
And you suggest working cooperatively with China. But hasn't China been accused of stealing as much as $600 billion a year through the theft of intellectual property?
You know, if you look at the history of all new great powers, as they rise, they steal intellectual property. The United States, this is a well-known fact, stole a lot of intellectual property from the United Kingdom in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and continued to do so until it began to produce intellectual property of its own. And then the United States went from being what you call the poacher to the law enforcer. So in the same way, China has been stealing intellectual property. There's absolutely no question. But China is now reaching a tipping point where China is now going to produce more intellectual property than any other country in the world. So China is going to join the United States in reinforcing tough intellectual property rules, because China now has passed the stage of progressing through stealing. It is progressing to creating now the largest number of new patents of any country in the world.
It's projected that China's economy will surpass the U.S.'s economy within 15 years and become the largest in the world. Shouldn't that be a concern to the United States? You quote General Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as saying that China probably poses the greatest threat to our nation by about 2025.
Yes. I mean, it certainly should be a source of concern for America, and that's why I wrote my article, because I was trying to be helpful to my American friends, to tell them, hey, there's a great new power emerging that will definitely become bigger than you. So you need to work out a comprehensive long-term strategy on how to deal with this great new power. You cannot assume that just because you've managed to overcome every other great power, just because you managed to defeat the Soviet Union relatively effortlessly, that the same techniques that you used to defeat the Soviet Union can now be used against China. And they cannot be used against China for one simple reason. From the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So the last 200 years of Western domination of world history have been a major historical aberration. All aberrations come to a natural end. So it's perfectly natural for China to return as the number one economy in the world. And there's nothing that America can do to prevent this from happening.
But weren't American policymakers convinced that the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that it was inevitable that the Chinese Communist Party would also collapse? Because as you point out, many people in the West believe that Western liberal democracy is the ideal form of government, and capitalism, they believe, is the ideal form of an economy.
You're absolutely right. And of course, I also recently published a book called Has the West Lost It, which is published by Penguin UK, in which I say that at the end of the Cold War, there was such a triumphalist mood in the United States and in the West, which is captured in the famous essay by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, which said that history is a one-way road and all societies have to become liberal democracies or they collapse. But the effect of that essay, as I say in a somewhat cruel fashion, was to do brain damage to the West, because it put the West to sleep at precisely the moment around 1990 when both China and India were waking up. So there are a lot of assumptions about history that the West has that are a result of a success in the Cold War, which do not apply in the 21st century. Because what you will see in the 21st century is not a return to the world of 1990, but a return to the world of 1820, when the two largest economies were those of China and India. And that's going to be the global norm, and that's the global norm that we have to live with.
Didn't both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush argue that political liberation would inevitably flow from economic liberalization in China? And Hillary Clinton said that by persisting with Communist Party rule, the Chinese are, quote, trying to stop history, which is a fool's errand. They cannot do it, but they're going to hold it off as long as possible.
You see, the sad part about those statements is that it reflects the fact that the West has got trapped in what I call a mental trap. And the mental trap is that the past 200 years of world history, which I call the aberrant period of Western domination of world history, is the historical universal norm. Actually, that's not the norm. The norm is the world from the year 1 to the year 1800. So China will definitely change its political system and evolve. But China has got at least a 2,400-year history with its own political culture, its own political traditions, its own political institutions. And Chinese history teaches the Chinese people that when the center is weak, the people suffer from chaos. And therefore, there is a deeply entrenched political bias within Chinese political culture to prefer a strong government rather than the kind of weak government that someone like Ronald Reagan would have espoused. So the Chinese political culture will result in China having its own political system that may take in some elements of the Western political system, but it will not be a copy. And this is where Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush got it wrong, because they were trapped by the conventional wisdom of Western public intellectuals.
The summary of America's 2018 National Defense Strategy claimed that China and Russia are revisionist powers seeking to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model to gaining veto authority over other nations' economic, diplomatic, and security decisions. That is totally misguided, as in your mind?
Well, I like the American tradition of using reason and science to answer difficult questions. And here, if you want to find out whether China, for example, is a revisionist power or a status quo power, look at the data. And the data will tell you that the Chinese today are the biggest beneficiaries of the current global rules-based order. China has become the number one world trading power. China exports and imports more products than the United States does. So China actually has a far greater vested interest in maintaining the status quo rather than being a revisionist power. But of course, there'll be some changes to the world order that China will try to make. For example, right now you're discussing who should be the head of the World Bank, for example. And you've had a rule since 1945 that the head of the World Bank should be an American and the head of the IMF should be a European. Now, surely, when the rest of the world wakes up, and if only 12% of the world live in the West and 88% lives outside the West, why should 12% of the world's population in the West decide who should run the World Bank and who should run the IMF? Now, that's not being a revisionist. That's being commonsensical about dealing with a new world.
FBI Director Christopher Wray has said, I'm quoting, you quote him in your article, one of the things that we're trying to do is view the China threat as not just a whole of government threat, but a whole of society threat. And I think it's going to take a whole of society response by us. Do both Democrats and Republicans support that line of thinking?
Well, that's actually, to be honest with you, a rather frightening statement. Because I'm actually writing a book now on United States-China relations, which I hope to submit to my publisher in New York Public Affairs by June this year. And one of my biggest fears about the future course of the United States-China relationship is that it will be very easy to demonize China. And why will it be easy to demonize China? It will be easy to demonize China because there has been, for centuries, an age-old Western fear of the yellow peril. And there's always been this fear that the yellow people would someday come and take over your country.
And
Now
we
that kind
had
of emotion,
discriminatory immigration laws as a result
absolutely.
until I think Richard Nixon became president and they were
Yes,
changed.
it started in the late 19th century when you had the Racial Exclusion Act and you kept out Chinese from coming to the United States of America. Now, the good news is that the Chinese people, fortunately, are happy in China, and each year 134 million Chinese leave China freely, and 134 million Chinese return to China freely. So they're actually quite happy to go home and be in their own country. So they don't have a desire to come and emigrate and take over the United States at all, unlike the late 19th century. But at the same time, when the FBI director makes the kind of statements that he does, he may be mining an emotional load in the Western mind, which is quite dangerous, because he could resuscitate the fears of the yellow peril, and then you would go from having a kind of a rational, careful, thoughtful response to China's rise towards a rather emotional and irrational response to China's rise. And that will make the world a very dangerous place.
Now, you mentioned that students, people who leave China to become students in American universities, 8 and 10 choose to return home. But on the other hand, a recent poll reveals that around half of the young people in Hong Kong plan to live elsewhere. 1/3 said that they plan to emigrate, and 16% said that they're already preparing to leave. And many cite social and political tensions as their reason.
Well, I think
it depends on where you are in China, doesn't it?
No. It also depends on we are talking about China, which has a population of 1.4 billion people. You're talking of an autonomous entity, Hong Kong, which has 5 million people. Now that's less than 1% or whatever. I think it's an incredibly small number. Hong Kong has got its own dilemma on how to deal with China. So I can understand the insecurity that the people of Hong Kong might feel, but that's a very minor problem. It's like saying that the people of Hawaii are very unhappy in America, and that's why America is an unhappy place. I mean, it's a small population, not necessarily reflective of the larger country. Because if you look overall at the condition of the Chinese people, the living conditions of the Chinese people have improved more in the past 40 years than the past 4,000 years. No population in the world as large as China has experienced as explosive an improvement as the Chinese people have. So you cannot compare the situation in Hong Kong with that of 1.4 billion people.
I'm speaking with Kishore Mahbubani, whose article, What China Threat, is the cover story in the February issue of Harper's Magazine. You're a professor in the practice of public policy at the National University of Singapore, but you were a diplomat for years. Where did you serve?
Well, I served in Cambodia during the war when city Phnom Penh was shelled every day in 73, 74. I served in Malaysia. I served in Washington, D.C., and I served twice as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations, which is why New York City is my second home after Singapore, because I lived there for 10 and a half years, and I love New York City.
So, in a sense, that has given you the opportunity to see the world from both sides, or a number of different sides.
Oh, definitely. And you see, this is where I believe that I can make a small contribution, because having lived in America, actually altogether for 14 years, because I also spent a year on sabbatical in Harvard University, and I've also, of course, lived most of my life in Asia. And I see a tragedy, a potential tragedy developing between the United States and China, which can be prevented and which should be prevented. But to prevent it from happening, the United States intelligence community and security establishment has to sit down and work out very thoughtfully a comprehensive long-term strategy on how to deal with a power that is going to become bigger, not smaller, than the United States. And it's inevitable that the United States will have to make some strategic U-turns to deal with this great power. And unfortunately, that kind of deep thinking hasn't started yet in the United States of America. When I was doing research for my book, I had lunch in March 2018 with Dr. Henry Kissinger in New York City, and it was clear that he also shared my concern about how the United States should develop a comprehensive long-term strategy to deal with the rising China.
But aren't there areas where there's just going to be conflict? Well, especially with the current inhabitant of the White House, for example, Venezuela, but also North Korea. We have seen an incredible Chinese incursion into Africa. Is the Chinese involvement in Africa different from the American Peace Corps?
Well, you mentioned Venezuela, and you could have also mentioned Syria. Mm-hmm. And one of the big surprises to many Americans may be that the Chinese are actually very happy when the United States gets involved in unnecessary conflicts around the world, because every time the United States gets involved in a conflict, like, for example, the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, that was a geopolitical gift to China, because China could keep on growing its economy while the United States kept intervening in the affairs around the world. Now, one of the most shocking statistics that many people are not aware of, which I actually mentioned in my article, is that everybody perceives China to be an aggressive interventionist country, but China hasn't even fired one bullet across its border in 30 years, whereas by contrast, even under the relatively peaceful American President Barack Obama, the United States dropped 26,000 bombs on 7 countries in 1 year in 2016. So the more the United States intervenes overseas, the better it is for China. So China is not going to object at all. Now, China, of course, is going to carry out its own policies, but China has no desire to colonize Africa. What China wants to do is to work with the African economies to grow them and to also use them as sources for the materials that the Chinese economy needs for its growth. But I assure you that the Chinese will not send the Marines in to take over any African country.
And you've pointed out that the tensions in the South China Sea have where 1/5 of all global shipping passes through has. On the one hand, looks like it could be dangerous. The Chinese have converted isolated reefs and shoals into military installations to assert their sovereignty over portions of those waters. But not one shot has been fired, despite the fact that there have been provocations on both sides?
Yes. In fact, the most surprising revelation that I make in my article is a conversation that I've had with one of America's best China watchers of all time. This is Ambassador Stapleton Roy, who's a former United States ambassador to China. And if you look in the article, I mentioned that Stapleton Roy told me that after a meeting between Xi Jinping and Barack Obama, Xi Jinping actually offered to observe all the ASEAN declarations in the South China Sea, which would have prevented conflict, and also offered to demilitarize the South China Sea. And Ambassador Stapleton Roy said to me the United States should have seized that offer and said, okay, let's agree to demilitarize the South China Sea, because that would have been a big geopolitical win for the United States of America. Unfortunately, as he told me, the United States Navy, in response, decided to step up its naval patrols in the South China Sea, and that, of course, led to the Chinese to respond in kind by militarizing the South China Sea. So this is one example of where the lack of a strategy in dealing with China can lead to mistakes being made in areas like the South China Sea. But on balance, I can tell you, since I'm a betting man, I can take a bet with you that there'll be no war in the South China Sea.
The Trump administration announced last Friday that it was suspending one of the last major nuclear arms control treaties with Russia. China was still a small and unsophisticated military power when Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev negotiated the INF agreement in 1987, so it wasn't asked to sign it. But haven't things changed a lot? Doesn't China now maintain a huge military, and isn't it building up its nuclear arsenal and developing new missiles?
Actually, you're right on one point. China is certainly developing its military. In fact, for the record, China has the fastest growing defense budget in the world. But that's because even if it maintains its defense budget as a fixed percentage of its GNP, since it has the fastest growing economy in the world, it also has the fastest growing defense budget in the world, and therefore China's military capability is growing. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, I'm actually astounded by how responsible the Chinese have been. Now, I don't off the top of my head know exactly how many nuclear weapons the United States has. I think it's about 6,000 plus. And guess how many China has?
I have no idea.
It has about 500. Compared to United States and Russia, which have about 6,000 each. And it's actually quite shocking that that China has not been increasing its nuclear stockpile, has not been increasing its ICBMs, not increasing its capability to attack the United States, because China believes that it has enough weapons for a nuclear war. And even in a limited nuclear war, the United States would lose, China would lose, and there would be no winners. So it's a bit irrational to step up expenditures on nuclear weapons because you will never use them. Because if you use them, you're going to kill yourself.
So why do you think we have had all of these warnings from Washington about war being inevitable? Is that just a way of convincing Congress to increase our military budget?
Well, I think there's an emotional dimension to all this because the United States has got so used to being number one in the world, it cannot accept mentally the possibility that it might become number two in the world. And I say this with some conviction because 5 years ago, I was actually invited to go to Davos to chair a panel on the future of American power. And the panel was very distinguished with two then American senators, Corker and Chambliss, a New York Congresswoman Nita Lowry, and Mike Froman. And I asked the panel, what do you see as the future of American power? And they said, we'll be number one. We'll be number one. Then I said, as my second question, I said, I've seen some data that shows that if China continues growing at the rate that IMF says is growing, China will have the number one economy in the world. So what will you do? And the responses of the four Americans shocked me because they all said, we'll be number one. We'll be number one.
Did you
Except Senator Corker.
Yeah, go ahead. Finish.
Except Senator Corker, who said, Mr. Chairman, I can do the maths. I can see where you're taking us. I'm not going there. So he was an honest man. He knew that China is going to have the biggest economy, but no American politician can speak on record about America becoming number two because that's political suicide in America. Now, that is a very dangerous situation in the world when no American politician can prepare the American people for the inevitable thing that is coming, which is that America will have the number two economy in the world.
Did you see the op-ed that was published in the New York Times last month by Derek Scissors and Daniel Blumenthal of the American Enterprise Institute? The heading was, China is a dangerous rival and America should treat it as one. Enough with the endless talks and handshakes. We need to untie the American economy from China.
Well, and see, this is exactly the fear that I have. That lots of Americans are reacting emotionally rather than rationally to China's rise. Because, it's important to remember a point that Henry Kissinger emphasizes in his book, which I think is called On China. The Chinese have a strategic culture that goes back several thousand years. So the Chinese are playing a very careful and thoughtful long-term game. And it's important, there should be an obligation on American strategic thinkers to do a very deep study of Chinese strategic culture and to understand it. Because if you understand it, you realize that the kind of wild emotional responses, like the ones suggested in the op-ed you mentioned, are going to damage the United States of America. Because I can tell you that if the United States decouples itself from China, China will be damaged a little bit, but China will continue growing. But what's even more striking is that the rest of the world is going to become coupled with China and not with America. Because already today, over 120 countries have China as the number one trading partner and not America. So if America decouples from China, America may be decoupling itself from the world and in the process damaging itself. And this is not how you handle the strategic challenge that is being posed by China. So as a friend of America, I'm telling Americans, start thinking carefully and rationally and not emotionally about the rise of China.
I'm speaking with Kishore Mahbubani, who is a former diplomat, currently a professor at the National University of Singapore, and author of the lead story in the February issue of Harper's Magazine, What China Threat? American Paranoia and the Myth of Chinese Aggression. We are now back with Professor Kishore Mahbubani. His article, What China Threat, is the cover story in the current issue of Harper's Magazine. And we just heard the Chinese national anthem. And Professor, ironically, doesn't the second line of that anthem call for building another Great Wall?
Yes.
Do you think Donald Trump is aware of that?
No, it's ironic. But, this actually, in some ways, is good that they have the line in their national anthem because it reflects a very deep insecurity on the part of the Chinese. So the main concern of the Chinese leaders is not to take over the world, but to somehow rather keep 1.4 billion people in China in a relatively safe and peaceful condition. Because if you look over the longer history of China, the periods when it has been united and stable and peaceful have been much less than the periods when China has been divided and in chaos. So the number one Chinese nightmare is chaos, and especially the chaos that comes from external interventions. So the big contrast between American strategic culture and Chinese strategic culture is that because the United States is so safe at home and doesn't worry about an invasion from Canada or Mexico, the United States can intervene in any corner of the world. By contrast, the Chinese worry so much about keeping their home safe that they have no desire to go out and intervene in other parts of the world.
But shouldn't we be concerned by its human rights violations, such as the detention of hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs? Xi Jinping has imposed tighter political discipline on Communist Party members, removed term limits. We're back to a situation, the Maoist situation. Term limits were imposed so that there wouldn't be another Mao. Many in the West have been alarmed by the enormous power that she has accumulated.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think it's right for Americans to be concerned about human rights violations in China. And as I mentioned in my article, I think it's a bit worrying to see the number of Uyghurs that have been detained in Xinjiang, and I think China needs to explain what it's doing over there. But at the same time, the big question you need to ask yourself is this: what is the best way to improve human rights violations, to deal with human rights violations in China? Now, if China was a very small country, like Grenada, which you invaded, right? Okay, you can invade Grenada, but you can't invade China. And you can't pressure China to do what it doesn't want to do. And the best way to improve the human rights situation in China over the long run is to continue to engage China as actively as you can. And, if you look at it realistically, from the point of view of the average Chinese citizen today, and, you remember that in 1980, about 80% of China was living in extreme poverty, and the Chinese could even get access to basic human rights like, life, food, education, health, and so on and so forth. They finally got many of these rights that we take for granted. So their situation has improved and can continue to improve, but you cannot improve China through outside pressure. You can improve China by talking to it in every dimension. So the big question for those who want to improve the human rights situation in China is, do you want to feel good by condemning China, or do you want to do good by talking to China?
But how should we react to something like Yang Kaitlin, an online celebrity, being held in detention for 5 days because she bumbled through the first line of the Chinese national anthem, and people being arrested in Hong Kong for booing the national anthem when it's played at a soccer game?
Well, if you visit many countries outside the developed world, China is not unique in imposing penalties on people who disrespect the national anthem. It's a different cultural issue, but it's also a fact that China does not have a democratic system. That's a fact, and so clearly there are far less political freedoms in China than there are in other countries. That's absolutely true too. The question is only one: is how do you improve the situation in China? And you cannot improve the situation in China just through issuing condemnatory statements or making loud international declarations. If you really want to improve the situation in China over the long term, you have to be very careful and patient and talk to them. And over time, China's society is progressively opening up. Because I can tell you, when I first went to China in 1980, the Chinese people couldn't choose where to live, where to work, what to wear, where to study, and certainly no Chinese could travel overseas. Today, the Chinese people can choose where to live, where to work, where to study, what to wear, and 134 million Chinese travel freely overseas. You remember in the old days of the Soviet Union, no Soviet citizen was allowed to travel overseas. Now, there's been a tremendous explosion of personal freedoms in China that should also be acknowledged by anyone who's doing an objective audit of whether or not China is improving or not improving its overall human rights record.
And you also quote a number of experts who say the U.S. should clean up its act. George Magnus and Martin Feldstein argue that in order to maintain supremacy in high-tech industries like aerospace and robotics, the U.S. government, rather than pursuing tariffs, should invest in areas such as higher education and research and development In other words, America needs to develop its own long-term economic strategy to match that of China's. China right now has a bunch of these programs, Made in China 2025 and the Belt and Road Initiative. These are very ambitious programs, aren't they?
Yes, and I think the main fact that American policymakers need to hoist in is that the China challenge is very different from any challenge that America has faced since its creation in 1776. Never before has the United States had to deal with a strategic competitor that can become bigger than the United States, but not just bigger, much bigger. Now, if you think that the average Chinese is, let's say, just half as smart as the average American, and if the average Chinese gets a per capita income that is half that of the average American, China will have a GNP that will be twice the size of the United States of America. Now, that kind of challenge you cannot deal with by posturing and making statements. You've got to work out a very thoughtful economic strategy to say, hey, how do we remain strong and competitive in many areas where the Chinese might someday become stronger than us? Now, therefore, it may actually make sense for America to actually copy some aspects of Chinese industrial policies and protect your strength in areas like aviation where you're super strong and make sure you remain number one.
And you point out that Boeing and GE have benefited from the explosion in the Chinese aviation market. You say firms like Caterpillar and Bechtel could benefit from the massive construction being undertaken in the Belt and Road Initiative region. What's holding them back? Are they unaware of Boeing and GE, or is this also a political consideration?
No, I think, unfortunately, you see, the Belt and Road Initiative has become, the reaction to it has become so emotional that, unfortunately, the United States is not reacting rationally to it. Because at the end of the day, it's true there have been some disasters in the Belt and Road Initiative, like what's happened in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, and Malaysia, and all that. But of course, every project has mistakes. But if you look at the number of countries, in April this year, there'll be a summit meeting in Beijing for the second Belt and Road Initiative summit meeting.
And what does that involve? What is Belt and Road involved?
Countries are going to turn up.
It's about high-speed railways. What else?
Oh, it's a remarkably ambitious venture on the part of China to create connectivity with so many different parts of the world. Let me give you an example of a success story from BRI. There's a country called Uzbekistan. Now, the people from one side of Uzbekistan used to take several days to cross the mountains to go to the other side of Uzbekistan. The Chinese came along and in 900 days built a tunnel underneath the mountains. And today the citizens at one end of Uzbekistan can go to the other side of Uzbekistan in 900 seconds. So in 900 days, the Chinese produced a tunnel that enabled the people of Uzbekistan to go across the country in 900 seconds. Now, that's a tremendous technological breakthrough. And if you multiply this across many countries, you'll begin to understand why more and more countries would like to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative voluntarily, because it brings benefit to their countries and brings benefit to their people.
You say, and I'm quoting, China could very well remain a different polity, that is, not a liberal democracy, and still not be a threatening one. This is the alternative scenario that the China threat industry in the United States should consider and work toward. So we should just recognize the fact that China will never really be a democracy?
No, I think I am actually optimistic. I think China eventually, someday, can become a democracy. But I can guarantee you this, China will not become a democracy overnight because the Chinese Communist Party saw what happened to Russia when the Soviet Communist Party imploded. The Russian economy imploded. The Russian people suffered. Their life expectancy went down. Infant mortality went up. The Chinese, who've had 40 great years, are not going to allow the Chinese Communist Party to implode and give up power anytime soon. So China is going to take a long time to change its political culture, and we must be patient. Because at the end of the day, we have to allow the Chinese people to decide how they're going to transform their political system. Now, the United States has got so used to dealing with countries that were much weaker than the United States, it assumed that it could impose its will on other countries. And so far, it has done so very successfully. But China is a completely different game. And that's why it's very important for the United States to consider taking strategic U-turns in dealing with China, because all the previous policies, all the premises of the previous policies cannot work on China.
You say that the U.S. and China are perfectly positioned for an infrastructure cooperation deal, but China's communist identity, more than anything, makes such cooperation unthinkable. Is it a matter of just simply the hostility to the concept of communism in the West, or is it because the two cultures sometimes really can't mesh?
Well, if China was run by the Chinese Communist Party, it would not have growth rates of 7 to 10% a year. The paradox about the Chinese Communist Party is that it has unleashed the entrepreneurial instincts that the Chinese people have very strongly. So the Chinese Communist Party is not out to promote communism. The goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to revise Chinese civilization. So the real name of the Chinese Communist Party, as I once said, should be the Chinese Civilization Party. So the question that American policymakers should put in their minds is it in the strategic interest of the United States to cooperate with the Chinese Civilization Party or to oppose the Chinese Civilization Party? And I can tell you that any policy of opposition is going to fail. And so at the end of the day, the United States is going to work out a new kind of modus vivendi with the Chinese Civilization Party, which goes by the name of Chinese Communist Party.
Do you think it's possible under the current political situation, or is it going to have to wait until somebody else is in the White House?
Well, and this is the reason why I'm writing my book in June this year, because I think the United States, clearly under the present administration, is going to have great difficulty reaching an agreement with China, although I must say something that will shock your listeners, which is that the most pragmatic person in the Trump administration is President Donald Trump. And there's one person who might be able to work out a deal with China, it is President Donald Trump. And so at the end of the day, we have to wait and see how the internal political struggle within the Trump administration is worked out. And if at the end of the day, some kind of careful strategic thinking emerges, then it's conceivable that the United States and China could work together and strengthen their respective countries, not weaken them, strengthen their respective countries by working together.
We hope that in the process, he will learn to pronounce Nepal as Nepal, not as nipple, and not call Bhutan button. But that's a whole other matter. Well, thank you. We thank you so much for being on our show today. Kishore Mahbubani is professor in the practice of public policy at the National University of Singapore. His article, What China Threat, the American Paranoia and the Myth of Chinese Aggression, is the cover story in the February issue of Harper's Magazine. It's been a great pleasure. And that brings us to the end of today's show. My great thanks to Kishore Mahbubani, to Reggie Johnson, who is at the audio controls, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, and to my executive producer, Jesse Lent. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.